Morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. I'm Tamsin Dillon. I'm welcoming you to the SVA School of Visual Arts here in New York, the Artists Roundtable. This is part of the Curatorial Practice program here at the SVA. The program complements the Curatorial Roundtable run by Stephen Henry Madoff, who actually runs the program as a whole. And in that program, he talks to esteemed curators from across the world to share their experience and knowledge. In the Artist Roundtable, we're looking at the work of an international range of distinguished artists who are making some of the most relevant and thought-provoking work today. I'm inviting them to talk about the evolution of their work, their current focus and projects, and also how curating has played a role or had an impact on their practice, maybe even working somehow as curators or in a curatorial way themselves. Today, as you can see, I'm thrilled that the wonderful artist Amalia Pica is joining us from London. Welcome, Amalia, and thank you for spending time with us today. Amalia's work, which you'll hear all about shortly, encompasses sculpture, performance, installation, video, and drawing, amongst many other kind of media and forms. Through this work, she examines systems of communication and what brings people together. She uses seemingly simple materials and found objects. She investigates human modes of interaction, especially our desire to be understood and the accompanying pleasures and failures of that. She considers shared visual codes associated with verbal and non-verbal language systems and often incorporates playful signifiers of collective expression and cultural celebration, such as bunting and confetti, ultimately exploring cultural intimacy and the political potential of joy. Her work has a lightness of touch and a feel-good quality, which helps to draw viewers into the conversation. She was born in Neuquén, which I haven't quite pronounced correctly, in Argentina, where her understanding of the world as she grew up was shaped by the expression of free speech and free expression that was part of what was known as the Dirty War from 1974 to 83, conducted by the military dictatorship in Argentina at that time. And we've just been chatting about this, and actually Amalia was quite young when this kind of came to an end, but I think it's important to mention that is part of her sort of understanding of the world as a child. She has a BA from the National School of Fine Arts in Buenos Aires and graduate studies at the Rijksacademy in Amsterdam. She has public commissions in various places, including in North Carolina, in King's Cross, London. Thank you, Marlia, which we worked on together. And in a train station in Amsterdam, which I think is a permanent work, which is fantastic. She's had solo exhibitions as well as shown in group exhibitions internationally all over the world. From the Museo Jumex in Mexico City, the Fundación Memo in Rome, Brighton CCA, Zurich, the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art in Perth, Australia, the Power Plant in Toronto. She's been everywhere, and in the process has received many prizes and awards. She also has works in many collections all over the world, from the Tate, MoMA here in New York, and the Guggenheim, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Australia, and I'm sure many other places. So you're now going to hear all about Amalia's practice. So thanks again for joining us, Amalia, and over to you. And I just wanted to say, do put questions into the chat, into the Q&A rather than the chat. And we'll have about 10 or so minutes towards the end to have Amalia think about some of those questions. And I'll jump in along the way if I think there's a moment for clarification or if I want to hear more about something. So thank you, Amalia. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Tamsin, for having me. It's pleasure to be here in my living room back with you. It was a good excuse not to go to the studio today because the internet connection there is not so stable. So it's always nice to not go to work. I thought I'd share a presentation and share a little bit of the of my journey. I have been an artist for over what 25 years now. So I sometimes will have to see how far we move into my practice, and I'll try not to just stay in the past. But we thought with Tamsin that it might be helpful for me to tell you a little bit about where I came from and in terms of my art practice and how that shaped it. I'm going to share the presentation now. Let's see how this goes. So this is me a few years ago, quite a lot of years ago. I'd say that maybe this is one of my first artworks. I had just graduated from art school, so it wasn't my first attempt. And I am standing here wearing a white pinafore, which is the school uniform for both teachers and students in primary school uniform in Argentina. And then I am standing in front of this monument, which is the house where independence was claimed from the Spanish colony in 1816. The house is commemorated every year by young students, by kids in primary school, and it's known as the Little Yellow House. When I finished my studies in Buenos Aires, so I was born in Neuquén, but I lived most of my life in Cipolletti, which is a small city across the river from Neuquén in North Patagonia. And then I moved to Buenos Aires to study fine arts at the National School of Fine Arts, the state art school. And then I graduated with a teaching degree. So I was teaching primary school. And obviously, as the art teacher in primary school, my job was also to like create all the backdrops for patriotic commemorative school plays. And so one happens every year in the 9th of July, which is the Day of Independence, and this house features as the background. So I was like very aware how like as a young artist I was obviously struggling and didn't have that many opportunities to show my work, but then suddenly I was like making these images and reproducing these images that came from these portfolio of national imagery, and sort of started questioning what my role was as a sort of image maker. And this house, even though it's called the Yellow House, what you see here on the image, on the photograph, is the image that I found one of those days where I was like, I've been drawing this house for so long. I wonder what it actually looks like. And I found that it wasn't yellow. So the house, it's not in Buenos Aires, where at that point I was living, but also where half of the country lives. It's in a province called Tucumán, in a city which is kind of in the north of Argentina. So when the independence war was being fought, they needed to declare independence quickly in order to then go across the Andes and try to liberate Chile, because there was like a sort of pan-South American project of liberation, which is known as the Bolivarian Dream, which is how the independence wars were fought. And so this was a private house. It was privately owned. And by the time it became a monument, it was like totally derelict and it was rebuilt, whatever. And then this facade that you're seeing in the picture was rebuilt again. The point is that most Argentinians continue to think that this house is yellow. So what I did is I turned it yellow with theater lights. The piece was called Class Period. I went to the monument. I got permission to sort of bathe it in yellow and transform it into this house that we taught rather than the house that it was. And I think that in my mind, what I was trying to do was I had this persona, which was this teacher that was trying to correct the experience of monuments so that it matched the story that we were telling rather than the other way around, rather than correcting the story, to put it that way. I wanted to show you this piece before I moved on to the rest of my work, because it turns out what I was trying to do was to sort of negotiate the world that we learn, the encyclopedic knowledge that we have of the world and how we experience it, and that gap, like how we know that the Earth is round, but how we perceive the horizon to be a very straight line, for example. And I was interested in that gap. But obviously, I was doing that through school imagery, and not only just any schooling, but Argentinian schooling. And so then I won a scholarship to go to the Rijksacademy in Holland, and that sort of really made me understand that I was making work about Argentinian history. So I feel like I didn't properly become an Argentinian artist until I left Argentina. Like while I was in Argentina, I was just an artist. And so one of the things that maybe it's important to say in the context of curatorial practice is that I don't think I would have gotten into the Rijksacademy had there not been a curator on the panel that year, who I didn't know, who was Gerardo Mosquera, who is someone that was very important for, and is very important for the history of Latin American art, because he helped develop the Havana Biennial in Cuba. He's a Cuban art curator. And he was able to explain to the jury how what the construction of Latin American histories, the myths around it, how it's usually told as a sort of a fairy tale, and especially the role that schooling plays in imparting a common imagery. And a particular take on history, which I think as North Americans you would understand very well. But Europeans have a very different relationship to history. Now I live in the UK, for example, they don't have sort of even a written constitution, because they sort of became a parliamentary monarchy. Whereas we come from countries that have like this date of independence and a moment of constitution and documents and agreements and these things. But anyway, so Gerardo was really fundamental in kind of being able to translate my work to this jury of the Rijksacademy. And so I got a place there. I was one of the younger artists. It's sort of everybody was around in their 30s. I was 24 when I arrived there in 2004, and I had never had a studio. I hadn't fully developed a practice. I did not know what to do with a studio, which I was given. And also I became really aware of this problem in which my work needed translation, and that I have to tell you all that every Argentinian think that this house is yellow, and all you can do is believe me. And there was a part of me that I just didn't want to become a representative of my own culture, but also I didn't want the work to exist as translation. And so these obviously represented quite a big problem for me. What I decided to do was to not let this be a problem that would stop me, but sort of perform the problem or grapple with the problem through the making of works that specifically dealt with this conflict. And so I made, for the first open studios, the Rijksacademy is a 2-year program, and every year there's like at the end of the year there's an open studios, which is a great opportunity, especially if you, like me, I didn't know anyone in Europe. It was my first time there in Europe when I went for the interview. And suddenly I moved there. It's an amazing institution where you get a stipend, and you get a visa, and you get a place to live. And yeah, I didn't know what to do. So what I did is I opened my studio, but I opened the studio only in a 45-degree angle. So the door was fixed in 45 degrees. You could still come in, but it was sort of slightly harder. But mostly what I did is I painted. So as you can see, my studio was quite messy. I just collected. It was like a living room. I just used to hang out there and have tutorials and think, and I didn't know exactly what to do. And so what I did is I took this sort of, I'm a very messy person. So I took this mess and left it as it was and painted everything that you could see from the outside orange. Now, orange obviously is a very It's an identity color for the Netherlands. Interestingly, it's not in their flag, but you might recall seeing them decked in orange for football matches and King's Day, which used to be the Queen, and that while I was there. It's based on the surname of the royal family, which is Oranje, which means orange in Dutch. So that's how orange has become a nationalistic color. So what I did is I painted everything orange so that when you approach the room from outside, you might have thought that you were walking into a monochrome room, and then, oh, because crucially in my presentation there's no image of this, but you'll have to trust me that when you walked in, everything that was not on that line of sight had not been painted. So literally it was this sense of like there is this what I decided to do was to replace this encyclopedic knowledge or things that I was learning at school and the difference in how we experience the world with like the knowledge that I had of Holland and how different it was to arrive there. And so it had literally this sort of identity image of a one color country that was built seemingly for export to be seen as for the outside. And then once you get in, things are of their own kind, they have their own complexity and their own color. Sorry that I don't have an image to show you that. So that, as I said, was like me trying to kind of perform this problem that obviously this was not a sort of long-term solution for, because I was like, what am I going to be? Am I going to be like this parachute artist? Am I going to arrive to a place and try to make it work about a place that I don't know so well? So I will always be operating in this sort of for export image, in this very sort of superficial understanding of a culture. And so I was just worried, like, then being invited to Japan and having to make work about sushi or something ridiculous like that. And so I just did these as a sort of a very partial illustration of that conflict. And then the following year, I made a work which I also don't have a lot of images of because I don't want to dive too deep into it, but I want to explain a little bit what brought it about and what sort of how it represented a step in a different direction, which is was a very it was a film where you saw this tall ship departing the harbor of Amsterdam, and then people waving white handkerchiefs, and how and then slowly it was filmed in 16 mil black and white, so it really looked like archival footage, because this also used to be the port where people migrated to America from during wars, and the slowly in the film you would see that it was contemporary. So I filmed it there, so there would be like people were wearing jeans or the clothes didn't match, or at some point there was like an ambulance that just paraded through the thing. And what it was is like a curator. I just, one of the interesting things also to maybe mention is that before I went there I didn't know what a curator was. So when I was in art school, I know I make myself sound very ancient, but it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was no curatorial programs. I think the people that did the job as curators were often artists who found that maybe they were more interested in showing work than making work or in organizing events. And so when my first the first time I met curators was at the Rijksacademie in Holland. There were some in Argentina, but it was also me being a young artist and stuff. Anyway, someone had invited me to make a work that was in the context of a festival called Sail Amsterdam, where they would have these tall ships come into the harbor as a sort of museum exhibit. And so what I did is I asked for permission to make this happening, which was I wanted to see if people would wave a white handkerchief when a boat was leaving. And I think it was me trying to look for a universal gesture of departure, to make a work that was about nostalgia, both in time and space, which was what was happening to me as a sort of an artist who had been trying to make work for a community that I felt had a shared visual code. I was like interested in whether there was such a thing as a visual language. I thought school would have provided it if there was a common cultural element to it. And so when I was like, and when that sort of when I moved context, suddenly that was all gone. So I was trying to grapple with this. And so I just did this happening when the boats were leaving. I gave people white handkerchiefs and saw if they would spontaneously wave at each other. And then, suspecting that the origin of this waving with a white handkerchief was quite cinematic, then I placed the camera on the boat and I placed the camera on the shore and I filmed that. And I filmed it in a way that made it look old, but obviously the tall ship and the time of the filming and the film format were three different times, but they all collided into creating this sort of nostalgic image. So I sort of became interested in the rhetoric of a nostalgic image. I just want to say also, and I'm sorry that there's only this slide. I just feel like it's the story that I wanted to relay more than anything. I just recently became I was invited this year to do a work in a canal that involved boats, sorry, and it was around the work of what you would call, wrongly probably, an outsider artist called Jerry here in London near Paddington. And the curator was trying to, like, it's so someone who worked so basically reclaimed a bit of land that's adjacent to the canal, and he has this sort of world building with quirky historical status. Your sort of a historical monument meets a garden gnome, sort of a sculpture language. And so there's this, it's called Jerry's Pompeii, his work, or that little bit of world that he created. And there's this curator, he's passed away, and there's this curator who's trying to generate attention around it. And I got to do another work with white handkerchiefs in which I sort of work with local residents to add color to handkerchiefs, and we did some waving. And so just to say that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are just ideas that don't progress in a line, but more in a constellation of interests. Then I'm just going to move on to like other works that I was trying to make at that point to try to overcome this sense of not knowing who I was talking to and whether that was important, and not being able to understand whether there was such a thing as a visual language. So I sort of became interested in images that function as words as well, like this one of the desert island, and it's obviously someone sort of drawing it with their feet on the snow. And I was trying to sort of, make work about this sort of displacement and what it means to be in a place, thinking about another place, but also these cliche images and how like trying to preempt what somebody is going to think about an artwork, or rather think about an artwork. What I was trying to do was trying to understand whether there would be something that people understood as images. I think there's a lot of people who feel very left out from contemporary art. And one of the phrases that it's commonly used is, "I don't understand it." And so I was curious as to there is something to be understood from an image. And what happens if those images are cliches, and do cliches like help our understanding or hinder it? And so these are the type of questions, which are obviously also very kind of questions that my generation of artists also inherited from the 60s and 70s from conceptual artists, no? Like ideas and notions around art and language, and what I became interested in is whether it can be seen as a sort of an act of communication to make an artwork. This is just almost like, again, a side note, but this is a work that I wanted to make when I was making work. So whenever you see me dressed with this white pinafore is me referring back to that teacher that's played with historical imagery and the distance with the monuments. And this is me painting. It's sort of a film, but it was also a public space intervention. So this is a way in which I've operated a lot, in which I don't want, so I often make ephemeral interventions or performances, things that don't last. And then I wonder what I can do with the documentation, and whether if I just show documentation, if I'm sort of asking people to like, to sort of to come and just see the aftermath of something they missed, which I feel it falls short of what should be offered in terms of experience. So I took this narrative notion that I borrowed from Levi-Strauss, which is this multiplicity of versions of things, so that when you're looking at the film, you are meant to be just looking at the film. When you are seeing the public space intervention, you are just meant to be looking at the public space intervention rather than a photo of the public space intervention. So this is an idea that I had to deal with this phrase that it's a sort of a very common riddle in school, which goes like, which color is the white horse of San Martin in the case of Argentina? And it turned out there are many places that have it, maybe with Napoleon or Garibaldi or different heroes on horseback. And so what I wanted to do was to paint the horse of an equestrian monument white. So that it would become that white horse, which also somehow puts this hero on top of the horse in the place of a hero rather than an actor of history. I had this idea in Argentina before I went to the Rijksacademy. In a tutorial, I told this idea to Gerardo Mosquera, who was this curator that I told you that helped me before he met me, helped translate my work to the jury when he saw it and understood it and could make a case for it. And so then I met him during tutorials and I said, oh, I also had this idea. I wanted to paint white the monument. He invited me to do this in the Liverpool Biennial in 2006. We didn't manage to get permission to do this. I wanted to paint the horses of Victoria and Albert. And I was not allowed to do that. And so 4 or 5 years later, I get a phone call from Gerardo. I hadn't seen him for ages. And he's like, I have the perfect opportunity for your project. I was like, what project? What is he talking about? And he was like, there's this biennial in Uruguay, and there's a good connection with the government, and I think we can get away with this. We're not going to get permission, but they're not going to, like, they're just going to turn a blind eye. There's like 18 equestrian monuments in the city. Anyways, we painted a few, and I managed to do this in collaboration with, so what Gerardo was able to do also was to pair me up with a conservator at a museum, at the National Fine Art Museum of Montevideo, well, of Uruguay in Montevideo. And we sort of developed a paint, which is not really a paint, is just chalk that's been diluted with water, so there's no glutinous component. So it would effectively, it's like I'm painting the horse with chalk, but because it's got water, it looks like a paint. And then what happens to that paint is it sort of washes away. So with the rain, and also we then hose down the monuments. But basically, it sort of became possible to do this work without damaging the monument. And so while it sort of inflicts in the territory of graffiti and that kind of vandalism, it was, I wouldn't say we got permission, but we also got like spoken permission. Nobody was going to give us a permission, but that was the magic that Gerardo could work. But it's also the opportunity that different contexts offer, I think, for curatorial practice and for the use of public space. So the more chaotic, the less budget you have, there's also the less regulation and the more freedom that you might be able to work, to find, or sort of, in the case of Uruguay, it's a small country. Montevideo is a capital city, but it's a small city. Everybody knows everybody. So we could get those contacts in a way that it wasn't possible in Liverpool, in the Liverpool Biennial, which is such an established institution. They still couldn't do it for us. What we did in Liverpool in the end was like published a series of fictional interventions to the monuments in the newspapers. So I thought I'll tell you about it. I eventually left Amsterdam, moved to London, and when I got there, Polly Staple was at that time a curator at Chisenhall Hill Gallery, and she came and did a studio visit and invited me to do an off-site project for Chisenhall Hill. And a big reason I think as an artist that I started making ephemeral work and work in the public space had to do with not really having the means to do another kind of practice, not having a studio, where to store things, having moved from Buenos Aires to Amsterdam with a 20-kilo suitcase, doing that again, then to the UK, and so I just wasn't lugging stuff around. And also, I think at the beginning of my practice, especially, I didn't have that many invitations to do things. Like when I did the historical House of Tucumán, the House of Independence work, it was like it was almost easier for me to organize the work and the event as one thing than to have to wait for an invitation or to have to be making work and not knowing where to store it and waiting for someone to. And I think it happens a lot in this sort of context where people wear many different hats. So the people who are organizing those workshops weren't curators, they were artists, they were, acting as organizers. And so when I got here, it was a sort of a more, a very wonderful, but also more official invitation. It was like, we have a gallery program and we have an offsite program and we have a curator of learning. And she works with schools and and it was like, what kind of project could be an offsite project? So I immediately panicked. I was like, I don't want to arrive here where I live now. It was just my first year in London. I didn't know how to understand what the community around Chisenhall, which is in the East End of London, who lives there, what might they want to enjoy from an artwork. Literally all these questions seemed really, after having sort of burnt myself with site specificity, which I have to also say was quite rampant when I was a young artist. It was the thing that everybody was talking about, site-specific work and located practices and these things. And so I felt really overwhelmed, and then just decided that I would walk around and look at the neighborhood, really is a neighborhood, and just wonder what was happening behind doors, and thinking that is what really made the neighborhood, the people that lived there. And so I quickly decided that I wanted to put my work literally in the hands of the community. So I took this weird carving of a granite plan that I had made. So originally, this base for the sculpture that you see here, the base should have been buried. So it was supposed to be a garden sculpture that resembled an echeveria. And an echeveria is a succulent plant, and it comes from Mexico. Echeveria is a misspelling of the person that the plant is named after, who was Atanasio Echeverría Godoy, and he was the first artist to draw this plant. And he had come with a royal expedition from Spain, and they were tasked with sort of doing a study of the local fauna and flora of Mexico, which that time also included, obviously, the southern part of the United States. And so he was the first artist to draw it, and it was named after him. I wanted to for another project that I had done in Amsterdam. This was sort of a sketch that I had, a maquette that I had in the studio, sort of thing, for a larger public artwork. And I had it because it was a chunky bit of stone that I liked. And so quickly it sort of became clear to me and to Polly in a conversation that it should be something that was already in my studio, that I would just going to put in the hands of the community. So literally this became a traveling sculpture. We had a sign-up sheet, and we had 52 people, families, stores, businesses in the vicinity of the gallery that signed up to host the sculpture for a week. For a week, and so it traveled for a year in the barrow. In this like little case, and what the gallery did was facilitated the meeting of these two people, um, um, for the sculpture to travel around, basically. And it stayed in all different kind of places. People documented it. It had its own Facebook page. I didn't feel like I wanted to ask people to document it. So I also don't have very good documentation myself. They could send a picture if they wanted. I just basically wanted them to have the sculpture as if it was their sculpture. There was no strings attached.
I just wanted to jump in, Amalia.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant story. We're down to 9:39 or 2:39, and it'd be great to hear about a few more pieces.
Yes,
I don't want
sure.
to speed you up because I love all the details and I think they're important. And
Let
I
me
think
move
this is a
past
really
that.
key work. I think it's one of the first works I remember seeing of yours. Not that
Yeah.
to have it in my home, of course, but yeah, just wanted to make
Okay.
the time.
Yes, thank you. So then what happened is this one that sort of getting me invited to do a solo exhibition at Chisenhall. And so in the last week of the of the sculpture traveling back, we hosted it in the show. But we hosted it in the office, basically. And this is also kind of an interesting move from Polly, because it was, again, bridging those two boxes of artists who work off-site and after artists who work in the gallery, and how that has become a really important distinction, or sort of distinction to sort of fight against, which is this idea of whether we treat museum and galleries as public spaces. I'm going to pick up on that in the next project. I'm just going to quickly tell you about the next time I had to be brave and make work about Argentina again. And this was when I was invited to the Venice Biennial, to the international exhibition, which that year, this was in 2011, and that year it was titled Illuminations. And then again, this is a very different relationship. This happens kind of at the same time as the Chisenhall show. And Polly is a very sort of intense curator who you have a really rich dialogue with. And then you get invited to the Venice exhibition, where there's a curator who works with so many artists. There's no real opportunity for dialogue. And also often it's sort of the main exhibition in Venice is supposed to also be sort of taking the temperature of the times. So it has a topic, but it's also sort of what's happening at that time in the art world. And so I got invited to be in Venice. I didn't have any infrastructure to really respond to that. Venice is a biennial that everybody loves, but it's been in a crisis since the beginning of time. They have very little funding, and often what you see is the disparity of the conditions of productions that artists get, basically. So I was there and I was showing next to heroes of mine who also had thousands of dollars as production budget, and I was having to cost my own installation trip. So I made a work with 700 euros, while there was work that was shown in the same pavilion that was made with 200,000 euros, which is also interesting to know in terms of productions. But also she put out, like, she sent me this, and it was illuminations, and it was, I guess, illuminations and the bit that said nation highlighted. So I took it to be something around light and the nation state. And so I decided that if I was going to make work about light and the nation state, and light as the enlightenment in my mind. So knowledge and the nation state. I wanted to explore further the relationship between schooling and state. And it was going to have to be about Argentina because that was my schooling. And so I braved, after like a decade of fighting with it, I went back to making a work about Argentina, which is this one, which is called Venn Diagrams Under the Spotlight. And it's just two spotlights, and they are hooked to motion sensors. And so you need either a person walking around the entire room, or you need 2 or 3 or 4 bodies in a room for it to come on. And so when the two circles are on, they overlap and they create this sort of Venn diagram. And so at the bottom of it, there is this text that said, it's written with pencil on the wall, and it says, a Venn diagram is a mathematical illustration used to describe group dynamics and logical relations of inclusion and exclusion. During the period of dictatorship in Argentina in the 1970s, gatherings of citizens were closely monitored as they were considered a threat to the government. Prosecution for participating in any type of collective activity was carried out under the umbrella of the national security law. At the same time, group theory and Venn diagrams were banned from primary school programs as they could provide a model for subversive thought. I'm just going to quickly jump. I'm going to move past all of this to go back to this idea of maybe a Venn diagram, a circle, and also public space and galleries. This is a few years down the line. I made this performance, which the first time that I made it was in Argentina. So it was one of the first opportunities that I had to go back and work there, which I hadn't really done because I left when I was quite a young artist. So I invited a lot of people to volunteer in exchange for a print that I made that they could have, to bring a chair. They had to bring their own chair, and I had someone that was in the know, basically, that was my lead performer, and they were instructed to sort of walk in a line, carrying their chair in novel ways, if you will, as if they were ants. And basically, what happened during the performance was that you had this group of people that would start would walk in a single file, and will try to like start to sit in a circle as if they were going to have a meeting. But they have to follow what the other person is doing before them. And at this point, we had sort of rehearsed it. But by the time the last person is about to sit down, the first person stands up and goes and tries to start to form a circle somewhere else. So it's this sort of constant trying to, I think what I think of this work is this sort of idea of self-organization and gathering, and how difficult it is, and how, and it's also an exploration of the circle as this ancient form of gathering, like from Stonehenge to Roundtables, and how I've sort of understood the relationship between forms and politics somehow. But the piece is called Assemble, which is sort of an incomplete version of the word Asamblea, which means assembly. So this work was first performed here, which is this is the Congress of the Two Square, sorry, the Square of the Two Congresses, as it's called in Spanish. But it's basically in front of Parliament, which is also the Senate in Buenos Aires. So it's a very political setting. So you immediately sort of imagine that this is a political gathering. And this was then purchased in this, this was bought by the Guggenheim Museum. And so then next time I had an opportunity to put on this performance was at the Guggenheim in New York, which has that very central and circular architecture. And we performed it into the rotunda. And the dialogue that established with the architecture was, of course, very strong and very beautiful, but the performance became very choreographic and very different. So I just wanted to use this work as an example of like how a work really, really changes with its context, but also to introduce this sort of other curatorial role, which is that one of sort of helping institutions collect works that sort of might not be traditionally collectible. And the curator who made this happen is Pablo León de la Barra, who is the Latin American curator of at the Guggenheim, who Tamsin probably knows very well from London, and who was very important here for the London ecosystem. But I just wanted to show you not only what it took in terms of like instructions and certificates and but also kind of imagination of seeing this piece and imagining a piece that then is completely different in a setting that also feels absolutely appropriate for it. And in where it sort of became silent and choreographic and aesthetic and beautiful. And it lost something and it also won something. And how we've sort of been working for that. So now, because the piece belongs to the Guggenheim, it's sort of whenever I want to show it, it's a very simple piece to put on. But now, if I have to show it, I have to ask for permission of the Guggenheim, and that goes through the normal sort of loan process, which takes 2 years, as if it was a painting that needed conservators in specific conditions. And maybe we're going to have to stop there. Is that true?
That was a great description of the way, the kind of whole evolution of that work and that whole process that you just mentioned of how work is loaned out. And obviously it's not just to do with the physical conditions of the work, although that is a priority. But I think it has to go through this process in order for it to be considered as whether the place that's wanting to loan it or borrow it or in the context is where they want it to be seen, which is quite an interesting topic altogether. And I feel like we've really only just scratched the surface and dipped into your practice. No apology needed. It's you've I love the way that you've incorporated how different curators have had an impact. And if people have questions, this is the moment to throw them in to the Q&A, please. And we've got a few suddenly coming up. The first one, you had an advocate early on to help translate your work. What would you suggest to an artist without an advocate to help translate works related to evolving human consciousness? Additionally, I know your work is in permanent collections and museums and foundations around the world, and I'm wondering if you currently have or have had gallery representation and how important that is or is not to making your living as an artist. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there's two questions.
And there are three more questions. So
okay, so I'll try to be quick.
We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, so I don't know, but I'd suggest you become advocates for these kind of artists. I think it's an interesting question in that I think as an artist you take responsibility for it and also for your own desires. It took me different stages of accepting that maybe I wanted to speak to a more international audience, and how that also felt like a betrayal somehow, of like, because you feel like then you were sort of going into this arena of contemporary art and what that means, but also coming from Argentina, and then having lived in Europe, you can really see how contemporary art it's not folkloric to Argentina and it is folkloric to Europe, and how that is different. So just the desire to be an artist in the way that we understand art also doesn't feel like non-colonial, if that makes sense. So it's a very complex topic. I think
this next, sorry to interrupt, the next question is kind of linked, I think, from an anonymous person. How has your career developed, and you've spread your wings so widely in so many different nations, institutions, and regions? Says undoubtedly the length of your career and your work are the main cause. So I guess you've had time to move around and so on. But I mean, did being in South America and London facilitate these things, or certain curators as pollinators for you, considering that you knew so few people when you moved to Europe? I mean, you've kind of talked about that a little bit with other conversation and the dialogue that you managed to have with Polly and so on. But I suppose maybe people are suggesting that there's a missing piece in the story, but there is a lot of luck to some extent in these
Yeah. Yeah,
things.
there is a lot of luck, but also there is I think things have changed a lot. When I moved to Amsterdam, I didn't know what a JPEG was. So that this sort of the technological change in in my life as an artist has been huge. I applied with 35mm slides to the Rijksacademie. So I don't want to make it sound that I'm really old, but a lot has changed. And I think a lot has changed in terms of access that young artists now have in Argentina. We used to have just one published paper art magazine, and now the internet means you can really like just look at the shows that I don't get to see all the shows in London. I often just look at them through websites, and so somebody in Buenos Aires or in Patagonia can see the same thing. So often is you end up with a lot of artists operating from the center because there aren't that many opportunities in the periphery.
Mm.
So I wouldn't be able to make a living as an artist in Argentina, or I wouldn't have been able to. And that was the reason why I didn't move back. It wasn't only because I loved being in Amsterdam. I loved being in Amsterdam, but I finished the Rijksacademie and that's where I had work. And if I went back to Argentina, I would have had to go back to a salary that was like, it would have taken me like, well, I thought I wasn't going to be able to attend the interview because it would have been like to pay for the ticket would have been 3 months of salary, and they'd paid for it. The Rijksacademie paid
Yeah.
for my trip to go and have an interview. So I
I
think it's
guess
also
you
important to think about opportunity and luck, but also
mm,
how those opportunities are not available in every context. And
yeah.
then in terms of gallery representation, which was also asked, I think I very much make a mixed income. I make some work that is more collectible, and I make works like this one, Assemble, that I didn't think were collectible, and they also sold. And but what my sales are not like, I have gallery representation. I work with very supportive galleries who I have great relationships with. Herald Street here in London, Proyectos Ultravioleta in Guatemala, and in New York, Tanya Bonagdar. And I had other galleries at different points. And they've all been sort of very fundamental in helping me understand how this practice can exist commercially. But it's not enough. So it's very much a sort of a mixed income between public space commissions, which we didn't touch on, but I also
Mm.
do. And then, which is kind of a different pot of money. And then some sales, and then fees for either lectures or exhibitions, or so it's a mixed income. But I think crucially, one of the artists that was really, really important in trying to understand how my work could exist commercially was Felix Gonzalez Torres. So Felix Gonzalez Torres is a great example of an artist who he knew he was going to die. He had work that changed a lot with this with in the spaces that he would show them in. He knew, he was had to live through and die by the AIDS epidemic, and so knew about the sort of the shortness of his life and how his work needed to outlive him. And he developed these certificates in consultation with curators and one of his galleries, Andrea Rosen, who really helped shape the idea of an artist certificate and instructive to show difficult works. And so he's a great example of
Great.
sort of.
It makes total sense that he's a big influence for you. And he a bit like you have this interest in crossing this threshold, that boundary between the gallery and museum and public space, and really kind of challenging that distinction. That's been a kind of constant in your work. And that's, something that would be great to kind of talk more about if we had more time. We do have a couple more questions. In fact, well, I'm going to just do them in reverse. The last one we have from Renee. Love the way that you do public engagement, stunning. And it's quite a short one. Also interested in the nitty-gritty. I guess that means how these things happen. how many pieces do you do a year, and are they mostly commissioned? But I guess that speaks again to the mixed range of work that you make.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I feel like I wanna now change this image, and maybe I will answer it through this one. This is a good example. So I don't, I don't know, like 12. I'm just gonna say, but I don't know. So this is for example, this is a piece that I did for my gallery in New York, which is Tanya von Agdar. And this really felt like an institutional piece for us. And so we had this, and then upstairs we had work that was more like maybe collectible in a way or another. And so if you count the smaller pieces, maybe that comes up to more like 25 or 30. But a piece like this, which is a lot of work, it's basically it's a blackboard where people are invited to write. A piece like this fills up like the entire downstairs of a gallery. And then upstairs there were another 30 pieces. So I don't know how you count. Maybe that's not it's not so much of a I just think I have very
You go with
different
the
kinds of
flow.
making work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've just opened a show. I don't know if you want to quickly show us an image of your daisy chain work. I know
Uh,
that was, yeah.
yeah, so this is a show in Camperline in Scotland where I worked with local groups to make daisy chains, which is this very pastoral pastime. Um, in my mind, very at least Anglo-Saxon or Nordic. It's not something that I did as a child, but basically it's chaining daisies together. And then what I did is I invited different groups. They all made daisy chains, and then we pressed them as like in between books, and they were lengths of like um half a meter. I don't know how you say that um, in some other metrics in
It's about
imperial,
a foot
but
and a half,
foot and a half. And
80.
then I glued them to the wall, but it sort of went all around the space. So I made like a sort of a crown to the space, and then I knotted them together. So they are like these sort of all these different hands connected to different community groups, schools, visitors to the space that made them. And then I sort of put them together, and they became sort of part of the work. And
And
a
that's your
kind of an
latest.
illustration of this
This
collectivity.
is like
Sorry?
this is your most recent completed work, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And these, for example, are another example of different kinds of works that I also make, which are embroideries based on my son's drawings, which have to do with like the moment before you learned how to draw things, no? In sort of
We've hit time, but there's
yeah.
one last question I just wanted to put to you. Documentation or lack of documentation has a big role in your work. Are there any forms or styles of documentation you'd like to explore more, especially for site-specific or public work? So is there something in the back of your mind that you've been thinking about that relates
So
to
the
documentation?
No, it's something that I've always been interested in. I usually collaborate. Well, I collaborate a lot with my partner, who's a filmmaker, when I want to make a film. But I have come to think that maybe it's not so important, and I think I'm in a luxury position to be able to say that, because I did say like the sort of the difficulties that arise from having a work like assembly, like that performance in a collection. But the main advantage is that there's a group of people there that are committed to being able to make that work happen when I'm not around. So suddenly, even though it's important to have documentation, I know that the work can happen again. I think one of the things that I have become interested in is how the work also exists as in social media, and how people post. And I've become aware on sort of how people might or might not photograph a piece, and how they're going to exist in different,
Mm.
yeah, in different people in people's phones. I'm just gonna maybe end in this work for that, which is a work that people would really like just this performance where
Yeah.
performers would grab shapes and make different compositions, but it really existed in social media. It was like the first work for me that opened that
Mm.
notion of like, oh, people will take a picture with their phone. And this composition that will never happen again, that happened just once in that iteration of that performance, will have another way of existing somewhere else.
Well, that's a perfect answer to that question about documentation. And it is interesting that over the last 25 years, we've watched this transformation where people literally take pictures and share them constantly,
Yeah.
which was something that just wasn't happening all that time ago. But so I think we have to draw things to a close. We're 3 minutes after the time. So and just thank you so much, Amalia. It's always a joy to hear you sharing your story and talking about your work.
Thank you for having me. It's
Oh,
been
of
an
course.
absolute pleasure.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Tune in again this time next week to hear the wonderful artist Sonia Boyce talking with us. And Amalia and I are now going to go over to a closed seminar session with our students. Thanks everyone.
Bye,
See you
everyone.
next
Thank
week.
you.